There has been a lot of commentary about the recent interview that Pope Francis gave to the Mexican journalist Valentia Alzraki about where he will be buried. That he has chosen to be buried in Santa Maria Maggiore Basilica in Rome, one of the major basilicas in Rome. And I've seen some of the headlines going around. Oh, this is a break with tradition. Oh, this is, another thing that Pope Francis is doing that is not Catholic, and people not really understanding that the historical facts about where popes are buried. And I just thought I might introduce a bit of history, a bit of culture into this debate, into this dialogue. There has been 266 popes since Pope Peter, and of those 266, you might be surprised to find out that the majority of popes were not buried in the Vatican. About of those 266, 100 approximately are buried in the Vatican. The other 166 are buried across different places, not just in Italy, not just in Rome, but in abbeys or in monasteries or in cathedrals around Europe, in Jerusalem, and in Rome, and different places around Rome. I don't think people fully understood this. If you just dig out the list and see where popes are buried, you'll see that there is a lot of varied locations. It wasn't just the Vatican. It's not. In recent years, yes, it has been a tradition to bury popes in the Vatican, but it's not in any way, shape, or form a break with traditional practice to be buried outside the Vatican. Because, as I said, 166 popes are not buried in the Vatican, and 100 are. And there are several popes already buried in Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome, so the Pope has decided to be buried there. What are my personal thoughts on him not choosing to be buried in the Vatican? If ever you've been to the Vatican, you will go down to the crypt and you will see several popes buried down in the crypt. And I remember I was at the funeral of Saint John Paul II, and I remember a couple of months after the funeral going back to his grave in the Vatican. Now, he was originally buried down in the Vatican, down in the crypt, had a very simple tombstone, and I remember just praying at that tombstone. Then they moved him up to one of the altars in the basilica, and they used the same spot for Pope Benedict to be buried in. And that's original slab that was used on St. John Paul II's tomb in the Vatican. That original tomb slab was sent to Krakow. You'll see it there in the shrine, John Paul II's shrine in Krakow. So, to say the least, if Pope Francis was going to be buried in St. Peter's, there would have to be logistics made for down in the crypt and somewhere else for him to be made. But I personally think he's making the right decision to choose the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore, which has other popes. And as I said, the majority, numerically, the majority of popes were not buried in St. Peter's. Simply, they weren't. You go around Rome, you will find a lot of tombs of popes that are not in St. Peter's. It's just a fact. And that's the history. That's the history of the papacy. So I do think people should be careful about the rhetoric and being anxious about the Pope breaking with tradition, and that popes aren't should be buried in the Vatican, and he's free to be buried where he wants, to be honest. That's the simple truth. And there isn't just one or two. There are dozens of papal burial sites. There are dozens of papal burial sites. I'll just let me run through some of the sites here, just to inform people on where popes are buried. So we just start with the list of popes buried in St. Peter's. Now, if we look at the full list, there were they're on the list in St. Peter's. When you go into that basilica, you will find that there are 148 of the 266 popes listed there. However, it's important to note in the logistics of finding tombs for popes over the years that there have been some popes that have been moved from St. Peter's to other locations. So there are several popes on the list that were later moved to other churches. St. Eugenius to San Salvatore in Lauro, St. Calixtus and Alexander VI to Santa Maria Monserrato, and St. Paul II and St. Paul and Pius III to Santa Andrea della Valle. So there are several popes, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, at the moment there are the remains of about 100 popes left in the basilica. So if we just go through, you can just do a cursory look at the locations of different popes are buried. You know, we have Piazza Navona in Rome. You have the Saint Anicetus, Pope Anicetus, Saint Cecilia in Trastevere in Rome, Sant'Andrea delle Valle, San Marco Evangelista di Capitolio, Roma. So we have down here, just go through the list, Nonarola Abbey in Modena, Santa Croce in Jerusalem in Rome, St. John Lateran, obviously, St. John Lateran, Bamberg Cathedral, so we have Pope Clement II, San Lorenzo Fuori de Mura, Damasus II, Salerno Cathedral, we have the Monte Cassino Abbey, Cluny Abbey, Santa Maria in Trastevere, Vatican Museum, St. John Lateran, Verona Cathedral, Ferrara Cathedral, St. John Lateran, Naples Cathedral, Perugia Cathedral, San Francesco Viterbo, Arezzo Cathedral, Viterbo, Perugia Cathedral, Santa Maria Aracelli, Santa Maria Colemaggio, Aquila, Basilica of San Domenico, Collegiate Church in Urzesti. Where is that? It's in France. Avignon Cathedral, etc., etc. I think people get the idea that even Marseille, let's see, there's different ones here. San Salvatore in Lauro, Santa Maria Monserrato, Sant'Andrea delle Valle, etc., etc. So there is, you can see that there is a long list of locations where popes have been buried. Santa Maria sopra Minerva. Interesting. It's just interesting to see Santa Maria Maggiore. So Pope Sixtus V, who was a Franciscan, a convent Franciscan, he's buried in Santa Maria Maggiore. So he reigned from 1585 to 1590. So it's quite interesting. Santa Maria Maggiore. So Pope Clement VIII, 1592 to 1605, also buried in Santa Maria Maggiore. Pope Paul V is buried where Pope Francis is going to be buried. Where else? So you can see there's and if we're going to say, oh, this is not traditional, well, what's wrong with those other popes that are buried there? So anyway, it's just interesting, so that you can just have a gander and look. Santa Maria Maggiore, they've even put Pope Francis down, even though he hasn't died, where his tomb is going to be. But anyway, so this is the tomb I was talking about. This is the tomb where Pope Benedict was buried, and that's the exact same tomb where Pope John Paul II was buried. So it's not, it's just to make people aware that real estate is at a premium there. So anyway, I just wanted to make people aware of the facts where popes are buried, because some people, may not know. And when you see headlines like Pope Francis breaks with tradition, is there a firm tradition that popes should only be buried in St. Peter's? I mean, when the majority of popes, the reality that the remains of the majority of popes are not buried in St. Peter's. I'm just stating the obvious, and I think it's important that we know this so that we don't go creating division in the church when there's no need for division. And if you've lived in Rome, as I've done, walking to these different basilicas, especially Santa Maria Maggiore, it's not a million miles away from the Vatican. It's how long would it take you? 20 minutes walk. So it's very, very near to St. John Lateran. We would have done the Corpus Christi procession from Santa Maria Maggiore to St. John the Lateran, or between those two basilicas. That's where with the Pope, actually, at the time, I remember doing all through the 90s when I was in Rome, we used to do the Corpus Christi procession from those two basilicas. A very, very beautiful basilica in Rome. And another thing that people may not be aware of, legally, under the treaty with Italy, those territories, St. John the Lateran, Santa Maria Maggiore, Castel Gandolfo, are legally Vatican territories. So if you ever go into the Basilica of the St. John Lateran Basilica, you are legally, technically, on Vatican City territory. I mean, it is another country. You're physically walking into another country. So if you've ever gone up to Castel Gandolfo, you're legally entering another country. It's a different territory. So to say that the Pope is being buried in the Vatican state, that's all I'm trying to drive people to be aware of. It's not being buried in the Basilica, but these territories under the accord that between the Vatican and Italy back in the early part of the last century, certain locations and territories were left to the Vatican state. So Santa Maria Maggiore is part of the Vatican state. St. John Lateran is part of the Vatican state. Where the Pope went in the summer is also part of the Vatican state. And if I'm not mistaken, St. Paul outside the walls also. And there's other actually territories or built places in Rome. That agreement between the Vatican and Italy is a very complex agreement. Another thing you mightn't know, for example, in that agreement is that the Vatican, under that accord with Italy, is not allowed to sell its patrimony. So people were saying, why doesn't the Vatican sell off its wealth in the Vatican and sell off this and give it to the poor? Well, there is actually an agreement, a legal agreement, that, for example, the Pope would not be allowed to sell off the Vatican Museum. It has to remain there. I'm sure they can exchange artworks and stuff like that and exchange things, but they are not allowed to actually, for example, La Pietà, prime example, La Pietà, priceless piece of art. The Vatican is legally not allowed to sell that piece of art. It's legally not under that agreement with Italy. So that patrimony that is in the Vatican has to remain there. Just people might not be aware. So the next time you see the thing, let's sell it off, while I don't think the Vatican would ever sell it off, but legally its agreement with the Italian state stops it from able to sell it off. But anyway, just interesting facts. So make people aware when we talk about what is the traditional place to be buried. Well, I suppose, it could be St. Peter's. St. because St. Peter was buried there. But as I said, the majority of papal tombs are not in St. Peter's. It's just a fact. They've been, they've been moved around because, there isn't a lot of space there left, especially in the basilica area and down in that crypt. You would probably have to shunt some pope or other somewhere else, and I think maybe it's time just to use the other territory, the other locations in Rome that are actually part of the Vatican state, and is just something that people mightn't be aware of. Santa Maria Maggiore is part of the Vatican state. It's administered by the Vatican state. The Italian government has no authority over that property. It's if you could just look under the accord that was made with the Italian government, and during that accord, actually, they built this Via della Riconciliazione, that main via that you go up to Italy. Actually, just going to show you something. Just bring in this. So I don't know if people can see. I just focus this in. So this is St. Peter's before the accord with this was before the accord. So we can see there was a whole palazzi and buildings here along this via. So they had to knock down this whole street. All of these buildings had to be knocked down up to the Tiber so that you could have that Via Reconciliation. So what you're seeing here, a lot of history was actually lost in Rome. A lot of history was lost when the accord with the Vatican happened, because over 100 years ago they had to destroy all of this part of Rome down to the Tiber. So a lot of buildings and streets and churches, I believe some churches were actually knocked. So it's just something that you have to be aware of when you're as part of history. And I do think some people are not aware of that. But anyway, just something curious for you to talk about. God bless you. Take care. Bye bye.